In this video, we're going to look at how to use Sumerian hosts. Hosts are 3D characters that are provided to within Amazon Sumerian that allow you to create custom speeches and even create digital or interactive Lex bots or chat bots. In this video, we're going to learn how to use a host just to provide instruction on how to use this scene. And so to do that, we are going to be adding a host and then creating a custom speech that allows us to use that host to communicate the instructions on how to use this scene. So in this video, we are going to learn about Sumerian hosts, connecting to other AWS services, the host component, and the speech component. So let's get started. All right, so I'm back here in my scene. And what we did in the last video was we added a scoreboard that updates every time we drop a ball correctly into the right bucket, meaning a blue ball in the blue bucket and a orange ball in the orange bucket. And that'll update. We also added a video here for instructional purposes. So when we play this video, quick video that I made that's streamed inside of the scene will tell you how to use this scene. Now, another way to do that is to use a Sumerian host. Hosts are really popular among people that are using Sumerian, and people are taking advantage a big time of how to use hosts because they're really useful and valuable features within Sumerian. Now, so because we are going to be doing pretty much the same thing as this, well, the host is going to be doing the same thing as this video it does, which is provide instruction on how to do this, on how to use this scene. So I'm going to go ahead and just hide this entity. So I'm going to go to my video entity, and I don't want to get rid of it. I'm just going to hide it so we can't see it anymore. So I'm just pressing the eye icon. All right, so I'm starting not from scratch, but I just have a blank. I have no other instructional entities within my scene, so we're going to use a host for that. The first thing, and this is really important that a lot of people tend to miss over or skip over sometimes, myself included, is creating and inserting a Cognito identity pool ID. I have already done it. I'm not going to show it, but I have created a Cognito identity pool ID and I've added it here. We're not going to run through how to do that in this video. There is a very simple tutorial that shows how to do it. It just takes a matter of minutes, if not seconds. And again, in the list of tutorials that we provided in the asset pack for this video or this video series, you'll find a list of tutorials, that being one of them. So make sure you go through that before you continue with this video. When you do, come back and then you can go ahead and insert this Cognito Identity Pool ID and you can continue on following with this video. Just as a warning, if you don't do that, your host will not talk, it will not speak, won't really do anything. So that's a really important component or a step within this tutorial. And if you are getting that where you're playing your scene and your host isn't doing anything, remember, it's probably because this is not correct. All right, so I've already done that. So I'm going to continue on by clicking on the Import Assets button above the canvas. That's going to open up a bunch of assets in our asset library. And the one that we want to use, we can really use any one we want. I'm going to go ahead and click Preston Hoodie. There's 3 different hosts currently at the time of this video recording. We have Preston, Christine, and Luke. But each one has their default clothing. So this jacket for Preston, this purple shirt for Christine, and this suit for Luke. And then each character also has an additional 3 outfits available: Christine hoodie, Christine polo, Christine t-shirt, Preston, Luke, so forth. You can actually customize those. There are tutorials for that as well if you want to put your own logo instead of the AWS or Amazon logo. So I'm going to go ahead and click the Preston hoodie. Add that to my scene. Preston will show up in my assets panel down here. And what I'm looking for is the hexagon icon. Remember, every time you drag something, you're trying to get something into your scene, what you really want to look for is this hexagon icon. That represents the entity asset type. So that's what we want to add to our scene. So I'm going to drag that onto our scene. It takes a minute for it to load. Once it does, Preston will be in the middle of our scene. And then I'll go ahead and reposition him as soon as he's there. Now, one thing I mentioned at the very beginning of this video series is that if you want to know what the scale is of these objects within a scene, Preston is actually, when I get into VR, Preston is just a couple inches shorter than me. I'm 6'2", so he's probably about 6 foot. So for some perspective, that's the size of this scene right here. So that table is almost up to his shoulders, almost really armpit level. So that is the size of our scene. So it is probably a little bit bigger than you might have thought. Because when you think table, you think maybe mid-range around the stomach area, but it's a little bit bigger than that. So hoster really can be useful if you're just curious, I wonder what this is like to physical scale. Add a host to your scene and you can get a pretty good idea. I'm going to move Preston over here. Okay, and I want to rotate him. Okay, there we go. Oops, zooming out. So I can just click on Preston. All right, so we have Preston, our host in our scene. There are 2 unique components that are added to a host, and we're going to go through each of those. First is the host component. The host component is comprised of the point of interest property as well as the animate using speech. There's also configuration. We're not going to cover that. But the point of interest is interesting. The point of interest is where the host is actually looking. Let's go ahead and press play and see to demonstrate something here. When I press play, Preston will just be, notice host by default have these idle animations, meaning he's breathing, moving his shoulders kind of back and forth, having real life or realistic animations to when he's just standing still instead of that T pose. But notice that as I move around, he's just staring straight. He's blinking, but he's just staring straight. We can control that. First, let's go ahead and stop our scene. And that is we control that using the point of interest. So the point of interest is right now set to none. Let's select look at entity. Now that opens up a target entity drop input. Let's add point light. 1 or 2, doesn't really matter. Remember the point light is up here. So that's up above him. Let's click on Preston again. Press play and see what happens. There you go. So now his point of interest is that light, and he's just going to stay there and looking up at that light really forever, because unless you move the light, which you can. Let's actually test that. I can move this light down a little bit. I'm going to copy my value for that Y. And see, as I move that down, he looks up. Or as I move it down, he looks down. As I move it back up, he moves it back up. Tilts his head back up. I'm going to return it to where it was. All right, so that's the point of interest property. Let's change it to something that's a little bit more useful. So going back to Preston Hoodie, I'm going to grab my default camera. That default camera is the camera that I'm using to look at my scene. So as I move around, the camera does move within the scene. So let's take that default camera. And I will say this is probably the most common way to use this, or the most common target entity for the point of interest. And you'll see why. Press play again. Now notice he's looking at the camera. And as I zoom in, his eyes follow me. And as I move around the scene, his eyes follow me. Now this is what's really cool about hosts. This is how detailed they are. Notice as I move just a little bit how his eyes just follow. His eyeballs are following. But then as I move a little bit more, his head then follows. So his eyes are isolated away from the head, and his head is isolated away from the body. And so they all move independently of each other, but then they also move together at the same time. So very, very well designed and created by our designers who created these hosts to make them much more realistic. I'm going to stop my scene. I'm going to leave it like this. When we add VR to our scene, which is in the next video, we'll add a VR camera, and we will change the target entity to that VR camera, so that when you're in VR and you move around, he will look at you as well. So we will change that, but for now we're going to keep it as is. The animate using speech property, right now we're going to leave it as is with lip sync selected and as well as gesture. The gesture hold time and minimum gesture period. This controls how long gestures, and you'll see what gestures are momentarily. But those are essentially these gestures that as they're talking, when you say you, they point at you, or when they talk about themselves, they point at themselves. So the gesture hold time is how long it'll hold a certain gesture for, and these gestures do have a defined length of time. You can cut it short if you want, and then also how long it's the minimum that it needs to be held before it can move on to the next gesture. So we don't really need to do anything in this property, so we'll leave that alone. The next component we're going to look at is the speech component. The speech component is connected with Amazon Polly. Now, if you remember at the very beginning, we added the Cognito Identity Pool ID. This is a special Cognito Identity Pool ID that is configured to connect with Polly, Amazon Polly. Polly is a text-to-speech, service within AWS. And so these voices here, there's, I believe, 52 different voices in 24 different languages. So they have different accents. There's both male and female, so you can select the voice you want. I'm going to leave it with Brian. And you can also control the volume. So these are not Amazon Sumerian specific voices. These are Amazon Polly voices that are integrated within Sumerian and are connected to your Amazon Polly service using that Cognito Identity Pool ID. That's why it's so important to do that. Otherwise, he cannot talk because he's not connected with Polly. All right, so that is the speech component. Now we just need to add a speech. So let's press the plus button under the speech file so there's no speech here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a speech that I already created. And what it says is, hello there and welcome to the Sumerian Training Simulator. In this simulator, you will be required to place the game ball in the buckets to your left and right, and so forth. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but that is what the speech is. It's really just instructions on how to play this training simulator. I got to press save, and then let's see what happens. I'm going to press play. Nothing happens. That is because we have not told the scene to play that speech. To do that, we do need to create a state machine that will fire that speech. Because otherwise, Preston has no idea that he's supposed to speak that speech or say that speech. So there is a state machine component already added. There are no behaviors, but we will add a new behavior. Press the plus button. And I'll just call this speech behavior. The first thing I'm going to do, well, let's see. Not the first thing. Well, yes, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, call it start speech. And we're going to look for the start speech action. In the select speech drop-down menu, there's only one speech, and it's called speech, because this is the only one we've created so far, so that's what it's going to be. We're not going to use Lex response because that is a different use case for this or a different tutorial. So what will happen is as soon as I press, and because this is the only state, this is going to fire as soon as we play the scene.
Hello there and welcome to the Sumerian Training Simulator. In this simulator, you will be required to place the game ball in the buckets to your left and right. If the game ball is blue, drop it in the blue bucket. If the game ball is orange, drop it in the orange bucket. Also beware that as you progress, the game balls will roll towards you more quickly. Look up to see your successful drops on the scoreboard up above. If you are not using virtual reality, use the arrow keys on your keyboard to move the buckets instead. To begin, simply touch or click on the green play button below the table. Good luck.
Okay, so that is how you use the speech component. So remember that if you want the speech to actually fire, you do need to create a state machine. It can be as simple as having a behavior that has one state with a single action that is start speech. You got to select, do need to select the right speech. However, if you think about it, what's going to happen in this scene is that somebody will press play, they'll then click the enter VR button, then they'll have to put on the headset. So that's not cumbersome, but that takes at least a couple seconds to complete that, by which time Preston's already going to be halfway through his speech. So to adjust for that, we're going to add one more state. And we're going to set this as the initial state, this new state 1, and we're going to rename it wait. We're going to add an action, which is wait. And we can leave it at maybe 600 milliseconds, which is 6 seconds. Then I'm going to tie it from here, from the wait to the start speech. So what will happen is when I press play, this first state will fire. It'll count off 6 seconds, and after 6 seconds, it will then start the speech. So it gives you a little bit of a buffer time for users to put the headset on and get within VR and look around a little bit. Again, you can also adjust this to 20 seconds or whatever you want it to be. So that, even though I said actually a few videos ago that we were done with behaviors, I did admittedly forget about this one, but it is a very simple one that you don't really have to worry too much about or change. If not, you could also do things like if you wanted to click on Preston to get him to talk, you could, for example, instead of wait, I could look for the click or tap on entity. And I could add that one so that when I click on him, then he starts speaking. So there's lots of different stuff you could do to get him to start talking. You could create a button that says, want to know, do you want instruction? Well, then you could click on that button and then it would fire the speech on Preston. So many different options. Let's go back to Preston Hoodie and let's look at, again, the speech component. Now we added a speech. So we do have a speech here. It's just called speech. And let's actually rename this. So we have speech. Let's just rename this instructions speech. Okay, so then as soon as I did that, you notice it changes the name over here. Now, if we want him to gesture, so right now he did gesture a little bit. He was kind of moving his hands a little bit, moving his head, but it wasn't like making really like more robust gestures with his hands. If I want to add gestures to my hosts, all I need to do is press the plus button here. This adds a default gesture map. And I'd actually already done it, so we do have two, but they're both the same thing. And what they do is it's basically a library full of gestures and the cue words that the Sumerian is looking for to then insert these gestures. So let's go quickly let me show you how this works. So under instructions speech, I'm going to click the auto generate gesture marks. I'm going to click that. Then I'm going to go back to my text editor. And let's look at our instruction speech. Well, so I had just straight text with no SSML tags. That's what's being used in the speech component. So when words like hello are seen, and when we add gestures to our speech, when it sees words like hello, it adds the gesture like wave. Same thing with like welcome. The welcome added a wave gesture in there, and the word you queued up the you gesture, meaning it points. Same thing with your and so forth. So if we go back to your gesture map, so the word big is a gesture that it's queued up by words like add or above, authority, big, cover, fill, and so forth. Same with heart. These are its keywords. The gesture in is queued up by these words. So when you automatically insert gesture marks, the Sumerian is looking for those words. If it sees those words that's in this list, it will then add a gesture that is appropriate for that, or seemingly appropriate. The cool thing is you can also edit these. So you can take out gestures. You can put in breaks using SSML tags. So I'd encourage you to look up SSML, just kind of standard markup if you want to add in breaks. There's also another tutorial that goes through what I'm talking about today, but in a little bit more detail, so it's laid out a little bit better, so you can see what everything does. So anyway, if you want to add in breaks, because right now, if you remember, Preston just speaks all the way through it. He doesn't stop. He doesn't really slow down. If you want to slow him down, you can add in a break for 2 seconds, so he takes a breath, or half a second, or whatever it is. So using this auto-generate gesture marks button is a great way just to get started, but it's not going to make it complete. You want to probably go in there, remove some gestures, add in some gestures, and you can find the gestures you want by looking in the gesture map. And so that is going to allow you to edit your speech appropriately and add the gestures. If you have too many, you can take some out and whatnot. So I would make sure that you edit your speech so it fits to your liking. And that's a really great place to start, though, is using the auto-generate gesture marks. So let's go ahead and stop or jump out of the text editor, press play, and see how that makes a difference. If you remember, I put on 6 seconds as a wait action for this speech to begin. So it'll wait just a few seconds. But
hello there and welcome to the Sumerian Training Simulator.
So there's one gesture is
in
wave.
This simulator, you will be required to place the game ball in the buckets to your left and right. If the game ball is blue, drop it in the blue bucket. If the game ball is orange, drop it in the orange bucket. Also beware that as you progress, the game balls will roll towards you more quickly. Look up to see your successful drops on the scoreboard up above. If you are not using virtual reality, use the arrow keys on your keyboard to move the buckets instead. To begin, simply touch or click on the green play button below the table. Good luck.
All right, and that completes the speech. So you notice, obviously, all those different gestures there in there. He was waving, he was pointing at us, he was doing just some generic gestures by pointing at the ground, and it's all sorts of different gestures. And if you jump back into the text editor, I'll go ahead and stop my scene. By the way, you cannot view the text editor if your scene is in play mode. It would have given us a message there, but you can go in and, generic A, you can make B or C. And again, I would encourage you to look at the default gesture map and to learn about different types of gestures, edit some, take some out, add some more in, and things like that. But that is the basics of getting started with Sumerian hosts and how to edit speech and use gestures. And remember, when you're getting started, follow the tutorial that we provided in the asset pack to tells you how to get going using the AWS configuration and how to add in a Cognito identity pool ID that will connect you to other services like Amazon Poly, Amazon Lex. And so that is the best place, and really the most perfect place to start is getting comfortable with that tutorial to have a Cognito identity pool ID that will work for this scene. All right, this is we're getting close to the end of this course. In the next video, we're going to look at how to add VR capabilities to our scene so that we can actually put on a headset and experience this scene in VR.